Okay, now it's time for us to move to a related topic to dormant commerce, and that is the Privileges and Immunities Clause in Article 4 of the Constitution. You can think of the Privileges and Immunities Clause. That clause requires every state, right, to afford citizens coming from other states the privileges and immunities of citizenship. You can think, I mean, you just sound that out, that sounds like dormant commerce, right? I'm supposed to treat people coming into the state from out of state, basically afford them the same privileges and immunities, the same rights, the same protections, right, as we give to citizens of our own state. So I'm not supposed to treat out-of-staters differently than in-staters. You can see the relationship between dormant commerce and privileges and immunities. It would not be uncommon to have a case where you would claim both, right, a dormant commerce violation and a P&I violation. Before I get into exactly how the Privileges and Immunities Clause works and what the test is, let's talk about what the clause was supposed to do, why it's in the Constitution. The Privileges and Immunities Clause can be conceptualized as the nationhood, right? The one country clause in the Constitution. The framers, the people who wrote Article 4 and the Privileges and Immunities Clause wanted us to have, yes, multiple states, but also wanted those states to be one union, right, to be one country. What are the fundamental markers, right, of being in one country rather than some kind of loose affiliation of separate, right, states or countries? One of the things you'll notice as you do travel internationally, right, is that if you move from one country to another, you have to, you have border checkpoints, you have customs agents and things like that. Here comes Lainey with her football again, sorry about that. So if I can't move from one jurisdiction to another without going through a border checkpoint, producing papers, right, having a passport, maybe going through some kind of customs, then we're not in the same country, right? If I can't travel from one place to another unmolested, then we're not in the same country, or we can't claim to be in any real sense. Give you some other examples, and I'll use my own. I can't remember what it was, 2011 or ish. I was in the first wave of faculty to come down here to Tampa Bay from Michigan. My home was in Lansing, Michigan at the time, and I got an email in my inbox saying we're starting a campus in the Tampa Bay area. Faculty who are interested in moving to the Tampa Bay area should be in touch with the powers that be. I had replied to that email before I was done reading it, right? I have no family in Michigan, so let's think about this. Retire in Michigan or finish out my career in Tampa Bay, Florida. So why was that decision so easy for me, right? Well, one of the reasons it was easy for me to decide that I'm going to come from Michigan, right? I drove down, right, with my dog. I drove down from Lansing, Michigan, down to Tampa, Florida. Was number one, I knew that I could make that trip, right, without having to worry about crossing, right, a bunch of state borders. I could make that trip, again, unmolested by any, right, I wouldn't have to show my papers or a passport or anything. So, number two, I knew that when I got here, there was not going to be a problem with me securing employment in Florida, right? If I get a job in any state in this country, I can move to that state, right? And I can work in that state. Now, that's not to say that I can work for any state, right? If the state of Florida says in order to work for the state in a certain capacity, you have to right, be a Florida resident, that's a different story. But just in terms of your typical, right, a private employer, right, I get a job in California, I can move to California. So I know I can travel to California or Florida or anywhere else. I know that I can get, if I'm a citizen, right, of the United States and of a state, I can also secure employment, right, in any state I want. I know that I can establish domicile, right, there's a word from other coursework, right. I know that I can establish residency, right, in another state with no problem. I'm not going to be, right, the state's not going to mess around with that. And I know that I can acquire property, right, in another state. So I've just listed 4 things that I want you to know. Privileges and immunities, what the court has said is, look, there are certain things that are really important and fundamental to what the court calls, right, interstate harmony. So they're not focusing on interstate commerce under the Privileges and Immunities Clause, they're calling it interstate harmony, right, us being one country. But you can see, again, the interrelationship, right, because if a state discriminates against people coming in from other states, right, out-of-staters, you're going to have both problems, a dormant commerce problem and possibly a privileges and immunities problem. Okay, but here's the kicker, here's the twist. You only do a privileges and immunities analysis, right, if a state is discriminating against incoming people, right, people from other states, with regard to those privileges and immunities, those rights really, that are fundamental to nationhood, right, that are fundamental to interstate harmony, that are fundamental to the whole idea of us being one country. And those, so far, the court has really focused on the 4 that I just mentioned, right? So if the state interferes with the ability of somebody coming into the state, right, to what? To travel to the state? To get work in the state, right? You see that in your reading. I'll talk about that in a minute, right? So to be employed in the state, to not by the state, but in the state. If the state interferes with incoming citizens from other states with their right to establish domicile or their right to acquire property in the state. So those 4 things, right? Travel, work, domicile, property. If a state interferes with people coming into the state with regard to those fundamental parts, right, of nationhood and interstate harmony, then there may be a privileges and immunities violation. I call your attention to a case, if you're following along in Chopper, United Building and Construction Trades Council versus Mayor of Camden on page 337. In this, we find out once again in this case that despite a dissenting opinion that had a different opinion, the Supreme Court applies the same rules to states and cities, okay? Because the city of Camden here had a set aside had a requirement that a certain percentage of the people working on state contracts, right, even if those are for private contractors, should be Camden residents. So what does that do? That interferes with the rights of people outside of Camden to come into Camden and secure private employment, okay? So, there, you look at that fact pattern, not only would you have a dormant commerce thing there because that discriminates against out-of-staters, right? But you would also have a privileges and immunities problem here because it discriminates against people coming from outside the city, not with regard to just any old economic interest, right? But with regard to getting a job, right? So when you're doing a dormant commerce analysis, just make sure you check it. I know there's a lot to this, but that's why we make the big bucks, right? At the end of your dormant commerce analysis, just think to yourself, okay, now that I'm done with dormant commerce, let me just check. Does this discrimination, whatever it is that the state's doing, stop people from getting a job in the state, stop people from traveling to the state, stop people from establishing residency or domicile in the state, or stop people from acquiring property in the state? If it does, I'm also going to mention the Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4. Now, how that works, again, if you have one of those 4 fundamental, those are what they're called, fundamental rights, right? That's in play. You see the test here on page 340 goes like this. If the state does interfere with one of those 4 fundamental rights, the court says it does not preclude discrimination against citizens of other states, the P&I clause, right? Where there is, quote, substantial reason for the difference in treatment. The inquiry in each case must be concerned with whether such reasons do exist and whether the degree of discrimination bears a close relation to them. Now that language should kind of ring a bell with you. It should sound a little bit familiar. That sounds almost like strict scrutiny. It is not quite, by the way. We're going to talk a lot more about that in common law too. If the state is going to discriminate, right, under the Privileges and Immunities Clause, it can only do that if the means are closely related, so not quite narrowly tailored, but if the means do a good job, right, of achieving an interest that is really important or substantial. So here too, you might see some exceptions. Again, I'm going to talk about current events. Well, what if a state says you're not allowed to travel to this state? What if the state were to say if you're coming from another state, you're not allowed to work in a Florida hospital, right? If you're a hospital worker from New York, you're not allowed to come to Florida and work for a hospital, at least not for the next few months. What if something like that were to happen? Well, traveling and working, right, are fundamental rights under the Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4. So you would apply this test, right? Are the means closely related to a substantial reason or important interest? The courts interchange the words substantial and important, so I do too. That's your test. If a court finds that those restrictions are necessary, right, which would be closely related to achieving something that is important, like stopping the spread of a virus, maybe a court would say, okay, under these circumstances, we can allow that. So again, you see some flexibility for states here, but the general principle is, right, don't discriminate against interstate commerce, and if the discrimination affects one of the four, what I'm calling, right, one of the four fundamental rights that the courts have recognized: travel, work, domicile, property, right? If the discrimination affects one of those things, you have both a dormant commerce violation and a privileges and immunities violation. Now you'll notice it doesn't really matter which one you use, because both of them have a means ends test. Both of those tests are pretty strict, and if you fail one, you're probably going to fail the other one. So why do we even bother with this? Well, because it's there, and because it's testable on the bar exam, and because if you have a dormant commerce clause question on a bar exam, I don't want you to forget at the end of it, right, to ask, does this have to do with travel, work, domicile, property? If it does, mention privileges and immunities of Article 4, mention what the test is, and you're going to reach pretty much the same result under P&I that you would reach under dormant commerce. Notice there is, right, the privileges and immunities clause, there is no part of this test that deals with laws that don't discriminate, right, like Pike under dormant commerce. Privileges and immunities clause only applies to laws that do discriminate against out-of-staters. They do that on, a law or policy does that on its face, right? And if it does it with regard to one of the four fundamental rights, you would mention privileges and immunities, apply the test quickly, and then move on. So that's privileges and immunities clause. You want to know the Camden case, and you want to know the test, and you want to know when to apply it, right? And we will then move on to the contracts clause, which will pretty much be a wrap on our study of state power to regulate, certainly as it regards economic types of regulations. Be safe, and I'll see you for the next video on the contracts clause.